Good morning, everyone. So a special day, a special interview. I have with me Yat Siu, the co-founder and the executive chairman of Animoca Brands. He is a visionary leader and at the forefront of advancing the Web3 ecosystem. So under his leadership, Animoca Brands could make a lot of partnership in different regions, starting from Saudi Arabia to United Arab Emirates and Hong Kong. So thank you, Yat, for accepting this invitation. Thank you for taking time and sparing time to have this interview with Unlock Blockchain.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. So you've often emphasized on the digital property right. Mm-hmm. And how do you envision digital ownership evolving in the next decade? And what's the role of Animoca brand here?
So the mission of Animoca Brands is to proliferate digital property rights. I think of digital property really as the new paradigm that really we haven't had a way to sort of access and unlock different types of property rights that weren't possible before. So when you think about how wealth was generated, really for the traditional world, it came from property ownership. And this started from property ownership of things like your cows or your utility assets, and eventually to things like real estate or physical land that you had, because the land would create value for you over time, right? And the greatest sort of wealth creation really over the last couple of centuries comes from the fact that we had property rights. And really, property rights is the foundation of capitalism, right? So when you think about the success of capitalism, it can only be because of that. But in the digital world, we don't have that. And so what's interesting is that even though the companies operate quasi-capitalistic in terms of the physical sense, the digital ecosystems they're building is not capitalist at all. They're monopolies. They actually control everything. They control the data. And the reason why I think they've gotten away with this is because most of us don't understand what makes digital valuable. And actually what's really valuable in the digital world are network effects. So the data, of course, is what's valuable, but then they create these network effects. And these network effects is something that we don't own. They're actually owned by the Googles and the Apples and the Facebooks of the world, which is why they're also the most powerful and most wealthiest companies in the world, by market cap certainly. And so what happens when you start to unlock this and actually give the value really to the end users who are creating this value? So for instance, the value of someone like Facebook doesn't come from Facebook itself. Sure, Facebook creates technology. It's the network of users. If nobody was using Facebook or Instagram, then Facebook wouldn't be worth anything, for instance, right?
There's no engagement.
Yes, there's no engagement. And what is it that actually makes it valuable? Network effects, right? The power of different users interacting with each other, creating value. But most of the value accrual goes to the platform, doesn't go to the end users. So what digital property rights enables is actually, because of Web3, the end user can now actually own a piece of that network. And the token represents the ownership paradigm, which again, is a new concept. Like some people, confuse tokens with currency, and some tokens function like currency, sure. But most tokens actually function as network effects or ownership of these network effects. And network effects are things that were not something that we were able to sort of tangibly hold. Like for instance, when you have a message group or chat room in Web 1 and Web 2, there would be a network that was formed, right? But there wasn't a way in which you could have ownership of the network, because you can't sell shares in a network, right? In the physical world, for instance, if Facebook, let's say you're a shareholder in Facebook, you could, there's value there.
You have nothing to say.
But you have nothing to say, and more importantly, your ownership in shares in Facebook give you no influence on Instagram. Likewise, you could have 1 million followers on Instagram. It gives you no say in anything that happens at Facebook, the company, or the equity ownership, right? So that means that actually there's no correlation between the network effects and sort of the corporate entity. But in Web3, the token represents essentially a combination of both and unlocks a new type of capital asset that didn't happen before. So I think of this also as a way in which billions of people can actually finally own something valuable. So one of the problems we have in the world is that most of the world is fairly unequal. You have the 1 percentile that are the wealthiest in the world, and you have the rest of the world that are typically basically sort of amongst the poorest or certainly not doing very well. And that's also the reason why we have a lot of tension in the world. And I think one of the reasons why that's the case is because the 1 percentile are the true capitalists, and the rest of the world are actually still stuck in the labor economy. They're not actually capitalists. And no, if you live in places like Dubai or Hong Kong or Singapore, you won't feel that, because most, as a population, are capitalist in nature because they're investors and they understand it. But most of the world is still in a labor economy. Yeah, in particular in the West as well, right? Yeah. Whether it's US or Europe, actually, they don't understand this. And so part of this also has to do with the framework of share ownership in a company. For instance, some of the biggest companies in the world, like Apple, they have about 80 to 90,000 shareholders. Not bad. But just think about all the hundreds of millions of people who use Apple product. Why aren't they actually owners in Apple when they're actually making Apple valuable by using their product and proliferate? I mean, every time someone pops up an Apple MacBook and makes a product that, like develops on Apple, he's actually adding value to Apple shares, but he doesn't become an owner in it. These paradigms actually are one that we don't make the connection to, but actually is really important. But it's also impractical. You can't have 1 million shareholders in Apple. It just becomes unmanageable. But you can have 1 million token holders. So that also is the reason why we believe in the future with digital property, actually you'll actually create platforms, sort of networks that are going to be bigger than companies itself. So when you look at Bitcoin, at about plus, give or take $1 trillion, right? That actually is the largest, one of the largest, if it was a company, one of the largest companies in the world, right? But actually, who runs Bitcoin? Who owns it? Who controls it?
This is the beauty of Bitcoin.
Exactly. So the whole point about sort of decentralization is actually giving community an ability to partake in the networks that they actually can add value and benefit from that. And I think this will also solve a lot of problems we have in the world around equity and around essentially broadly the problems we have right now.
So yet, I don't want to call it a hype now on real world asset tokenization, right? And somehow regulators are looking into it and things are moving forward.
Of course.
But this is not what I want. This is not what you want. This is good. But somehow the missing is where the digital native assets creation. Why we're still away of this?
Yes.
Why we cannot have these kind of digitally native, not attached to any real world asset, like whenever we're still talking in the financial industry, but there's no creation of digital assets.
So first of all, I actually think that the traditional finance world already has a concept around trying to value intangibles, right? Because that's kind of what they call that. They call them intangible goods. Well, what's an intangible? Goodwill, brand, that type of stuff. And so it sits in your balance sheet as a type of asset. So there is a way to measure that. I mean, for instance, what's the value of the Tesla brand? Or what's the value of a Nike or an Adidas brand? I mean, these are brands that are incredibly powerful that don't equate to how much revenue it generates because they actually have a kind of network effect, some kind of value, right? So however, people haven't often made the connection is that actually you can now create a way in which you can value the network effects of that goodwill in the form of a token. And so when you see a token having a certain value, it's the community that's essentially sort of bringing some kind of brand effect into it. And therefore, of course, it's volatile, but there's an element where you can now measure sort of, what is that sort of intangible quality based on the, based on the implied network effects. And just like any fashion trend, for instance, some network effects or some fashion trends last the ages, and some only last 1 season, right? And so I think this is kind of where we are right now. And I think because of the sort of speed in which tokens can be sort of created and the speed of essentially the financification of that, it feels very volatile and people are a little nervous about it, but actually in reality, that's how the world already operates when you think about small businesses and new ideas that are being created all the time. Now, I agree with you though, that I'm much more excited about new type of property that can be essentially through tokenization can be put to life than rather taking an existing one. Like I'm less excited about real estate, even though I know it's incremental and it's going to add a lot of value.
It's working well.
Yeah, but it doesn't add anything to it. But for instance, when you think about gaming and gaming items, I'm excited about that because gamers don't have a way in which you can really own their assets at this moment in time. And a lot of people confuse this with, well, what do I do with the asset? You could trade it maybe, but really I look at it also as reputation. So if I own these assets, I'm actually proving that I've done this in the game and it gives me benefits going forward. Like when, one of the big values of having something that's physical, maybe the house you live in or the car that you own or the watch that you have, actually they emanate a kind of status and they give you access to certain networks because you have the ownership of this and it gives you credit. And that's kind of how we see it with these virtual items. So we're really excited about that. But there is a place for RWAs, right? So for instance, not too long ago, this year, I tokenized a sort of rare expensive violin, a Stradivarius, right? And the strat is an RWA. It doesn't really change much, except now if you tokenize that, you could potentially give it to access to essentially an asset class that people would normally not have access to because it depreciates about 12 to 15% a year. So that's kind of one area of interest. But I think the bigger message isn't that it appreciates. The bigger message is that now people who are interested in this could have access to something they couldn't have before. So I think one of the real problems we have in the world is that most people are not financially literate. Sure, they have access to a bank account, but they know nothing about investing.
Not all of them, by the way.
Exactly. However, they may have a bank account. Even if you have a bank account, they don't have an investment portfolio. They don't invest. And the reason they don't do that is because they're not interested in it. It's not about whether they need to do it. Sure, they understand I need to make some money or I need to diversify my portfolio, but they have no interest in this, right? And that's because some people are interested in the industry of money and investing, but most people are interested in what they love to do. Maybe it's music, maybe it's art, right? And then this idea of them also having to understand how to invest and make money seems remote to them because the field of interest between the industries that are about money and investing tend not to be in the fields of interest that they themselves are active in. So for instance, when NFTs came into the market, artists started to realize, wait, there is an element around art for both collectors and creators that you could potentially make money. And despite what people say about NFTs, it's still a $10 billion market, right? And so therefore now, actually what's happened is that more artists have become more financially literate. They start buying other NFTs or maybe other tokens or maybe other equities, doesn't matter. They've basically become more financially literate. That's what happens when you become truly into Web3. You actually start to learn something about money and finance.
To jump in.
Exactly, you have to jump in. Exactly. But then you understand something about money that you didn't do before, right? So these people who were into art or artists now actually became more financially literate. And so I see that as the opening up for RWAs. So for instance, if you're sort of tokenizing real estate, again, it's incremental, but most people who are into real estate generally are also investors, so they kind of understand it. But if you do tokenization of something that's maybe in the music industry or in the art industry or maybe sports or other areas that haven't really been tapped into, that actually opens up markets and creates interest and then onboards them to understand more about, oh, okay, you can much easier explain to someone about the value of money when he's interested or loves the topic rather than it's something that's foreign to him. So I think there is value with RWAs for onboarding. Look at Bitcoin ETFs, right? I mean, Bitcoin ETFs are probably one of the best examples, even though it's not an RWA in the strictest sense, in terms of how do you bring traditional institutions into it. It's tokenization. People are interested in. Now that they have access to this asset class, they're like, oh, okay, what else can I do? And again, it's all part of sort of the onboarding.
Yeah. So taking this dream forward, so what are the regulatory challenges here that you're seeing every day, especially that you are somehow operating in different markets as well as your portfolio companies?
Yeah.
And what is the main message for government to look when looking into this space?
Well, so first of all, I think regulations may be a little bit different, but broadly speaking, it's all around consumer protection. So I do think that there is a number of areas in Web3 that sort of need some catching up to do, right? So one is the pure financial element. Frankly, that has had quite a bit of progress, right? Whether it's Dubai or Hong Kong or Singapore or even Japan, they've got more and more developed frameworks. I mean, even in Europe with MiCA, there are more developed frameworks around essentially the pure sort of, financial/commodities nature of tokens. And that's been the focus. But there's also other areas, for instance, that are generally not being sort of regulated in an official sense, like NFTs or gaming items. Right, well, DeFi, I think, depending who you talk to, DeFi, I think, is moving a little bit more into the financial side of things. Whereas, for instance, NFTs and gaming are definitely not in that area. Yeah. And whether it's treated as a collectible or whether it's treated as something that you use as a utility, they're treated really not in that context. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't have some kind of consumer protection. So for me, for instance, like whether it's a game or whether it's an NFT collection, I think there's an element of consumer protection that is needed. So for instance, if someone sells you a car and the car can't drive, well, you
have to come back to someone.
Yeah, you're entitled for a refund, right? So I think that's exactly the same thing in Web3. So I think let's call it the gaming or the NFT space, I think will be more subject towards classic consumer protection laws. Whereas I think the sort of the financial side of things, which are much more sort of like commodities-like, are probably going to be subject to sort of more the traditional financial regulator side of things. And right now, I can tell you based on our own experience that 99% of all the effort is really focused around the fungible token side in terms of regulating that before they even start looking at the other areas. And in most cases, they don't want to, because it's like, who's regulating the art industry? who's regulating the gaming industry. It's not really regulated in that sense, right? It's more about sort of making sure that you basically are providing some form of consumer protection. And that, I think, is the emphasis. And for all the regulators, the primary area is how do we protect the consumer?
This is an interesting view because this is important and make it easier for everybody. And it is just a process of educating more the regulator about the
trust and
right,
safety. So trust and safety are related to each other. And one of the problems I think we have in Web3 is also, and this is what we're trying to solve with Mochaverse, is that it's not the fact that things are volatile. That happens, right? It's the fact that you can't necessarily trust who the counterparty is, right? Because he's anonymous or he's someone that doesn't have a reputation that you can follow on. And I think this is something that we're now trying to solve with Mochaverse by creating the Mocha ID. We're trying to create a reputation layer that creates more trust in the ecosystem. Right now, you could be dealing with a wallet that you've never done transaction with. And that actually happens, for instance, with things like airdrops. Most of the wallets are wallets you've never heard of. No reputation is being accrued on that because there's no consequence. But that doesn't work in real life. Imagine if you're doing business with a new person every single day, right? You can't build that. Or imagine if there's a society where people actually don't know each other at all and can't build trust. In fact, when you think about the way that we invest in trust and reputation, I think that's the longest type of investment that you make. For instance, once you have a reputation, you will make sure to protect that reputation. And other people will attest that you have a good reputation or a bad reputation, for instance, right? And that actually is how you build trust in an ecosystem, by having reputation. And in Web3, I think we've confused this idea of anonymity, which is the right to privacy, absolutely, with this idea that we don't have to worry about trust anymore. Yeah. And actually, that doesn't make sense, right? But with blockchain, you can have, with zero knowledge, the ability to still prove your reputation without actually giving up your full identity, right? And I think this is actually where I think blockchain really solves this sort of issue around preserving privacy with the right type of anonymity, but also making sure that the person you're dealing with has a reputation and a trust layer that you can actually do business with or connect with.
There have been reports about thinking Animoca Brands, taking Animoca Brands public. And
sure.
IPO. So,
yes, that's not a secret. I mean, we've been talking about this.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And it is between somewhere between Hong Kong and this and Middle East. So,
potentially, yes.
So why these two regions, and what the IPO might change?
So first, I think we enjoy very strong investor support in both of these regions. As you know, it's not just UAE where we have institutions and family offices, investors, but also Saudi with NEOM and other Saudi investments groups.
This was my next question.
Yeah, but basically they're also part of Animoca, and of course Hong Kong is our home base. Hong Kong has also been very forward on Web3, generally very friendly. Putting clearer regulation. I'm part of the Web3 task force in Hong Kong. So these are things that sort of allow Hong Kong to be a good sort of place. But also Hong Kong is one of the biggest financial centers in the world. So some of the biggest companies in the world are listed in Hong Kong, right? The companies you've heard of, whether this is like Tencent or so on, right? So again, I would argue that Hong Kong is not a bad market. But of course, this process takes time, and we haven't fully decided. But when asked the question, which are your favorite candidates, we would say it's one of the two are our favorite candidates, right? For obvious reasons, the US does not make sense for us, right? And also, our market isn't really US. Our market has been broadly the rest of the world outside of the US. We have made investments for US companies, but really our customer base hasn't been there. So,
How could such an IPO change Animoca Brands?
Well, so again, I look at sort of an IPO as a way of onboarding people to Web3. So it's part of our mission. How do we get people sort of onboarded? So for instance, I think Coinbase in the US is a great example of onboarding people into crypto, into the world of Web3, without actually owning a token. Right? By owning basically Coinbase shares, you're kind of semi-exposed to the market. Yes, it's not the same as owning Bitcoin or whatever, but you start learning about this, right? Because the traditional investor, he doesn't have a wallet or he's not comfortable with this. But you know what? He could invest in a company that actually is involved in the space. That's their proxy for having access to this, and then they learn about the space, right? To me, that's exactly the same thing. Like, you need to have an avenue where, not just a sort of Web3 native person can invest in what you do, but actually the general public can also partake. And that's basically through an IPO, I think, would be the right way to do it. And in terms of scale, revenue size, and assets, I think Animoca is probably one of the best positioned companies to do so. And we don't really have a Coinbase equivalent. We're not an exchange, just to be clear. But we don't really have a Coinbase equivalent in nature in Asia. that is public, right? So I think Animoca Brands could potentially fulfill that role, and as a result, we could then obviously onboard more people into Web3 as well as part of that.
Going back to Saudi Arabia, so you did amazing. It's a new frontier for Web3, and
yes.
With your hub there and NEOM onboarding
Yes.
NEOM as partners. So how much do you feel like Animoca Brands is more associated with the vision of Saudi Arabia?
Very much aligned. I think of, what Animoca was known for was, we proliferated the term open metaverse, and we were all about building essentially this new sort of virtual world, as it were. Well, in some ways that's actually Dubai as well, but I definitely think of what NEOM is building as basically the physical metaverse, right? I mean, they're basically constructing an entire new nation of sorts, from scratch, with the physical elements, but now also with the digital elements, and they want to integrate blockchain to do that. And this is kind of our role, for instance, here. So it's very much aligned, right? How do you build a better future that basically implements not just cool new technologies, but actually does it in a way that's, in service for humanity, and also creates basically new opportunities and frameworks? That to me is very much aligned with what we do. And,
gaming.
Huh?
The gaming.
And of course, let's not forget, Saudi
gaming.
is deep in gaming, but I think maybe the other way to look at Saudi is not just gaming, it's just generally deep in digital. It's a very young population, right? On average, most of the people are under the age of 38 or 35, right? So it's a very young population, and therefore they're digitally native. So that's kind of their world. So again, blockchain makes sense, right? They're of course playing a lot of games, but they're doing other things as well. And again, we do games, we're involved in the space, so all of that ties in and matches up really quite nicely. So that's again one area of development I think that is that we're excited about. But also, Saudi is, taking in an Asian parallel, is the China of the Middle East, right? In terms of scale, size, growth, opportunity, right? And therefore, when you think about which country in the world is actually in a growth path, actually not that many.
Yeah.
Saudi is definitely one of them. Of course, UAE as well, that region. And so I think it's not crazy to say that this could be sort of this region's sort of, let's call it decade, as it were, right? Or decades for that matter. And so which are the countries and nations you want to work together with? Those are the ones that have the biggest potential, and definitely Saudi and UAE are
share the same vision as well.
Exactly, yeah.
So I'll end up by a question that I really would love personally to know the answer about is UAE. So for the last couple of years, for the last 4 or 5 years actually, they've been doing amazing work in the Web3 space, from both Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And there's still one missing element, in my opinion, for this ecosystem to be on the path that we all dream about. Is there's a lack of the presence of VCs, international VCs and big players in the market that can really support companies and startups from the seed level at the beginning. So why do you think so, and what should be done?
So as I understand, actually the question you're asking is, how do you turn a place like Dubai from what appears to be a more following mentality of basically investing into leadering, as in becoming a leader in investing? Okay, so when you look at, for instance, what happened in Silicon Valley, the foundation of much of its investing philosophy didn't specifically just come from people who are pure financial investors. Those were all based in New York. It was actually based on people who were founders and entrepreneurs. And then, as they grew older, had success, they started funds themselves. One of the big secrets about Silicon Valley is not the fact that it is, great technology or has great infrastructure. Last time, if you go to Palo Alto, actually the infrastructure in Dubai is much, much better than the infrastructure in California, which is really often a mess. Sometimes my Zoom calls go out and my mobile connection doesn't work. So what's the secret? The secret is that everyone's an angel investor and everyone's looking to invest. Like investing is like a sport. But also what's happening is that people are interested in the technology because they've seen success that way. And it is a founder-led investing mindset, which is different from a place like Dubai. But it's not that Dubai can't get there. It's because Dubai actually is still young. Think about what is Dubai's history. It was pearl fishing, right? And really, 20 years ago, there was nothing here. And now you've got this stage. So following is not a bad mindset, because from following you can then evolve into, when you have successful entrepreneurs that come from things outside of real estate, like whether it's technology or whatever, then what happens is if you make money in technology, then actually you'll reinvest it in technology because that's what you understand. If you make money in real estate, guess what? You put money back into real estate because that's kind of what you understand, right? So you have to go through those evolutions. So for instance, when you look at China, some of the biggest markets, some of the biggest VCs are now Chinese. Why? Because they were also founders of their time, right? I mean, Sequoia China, Neil was founder of C-Trip, for instance, and other many companies that were very successful. And now he's one of the most celebrated investors because he knew how to build companies, he had that experience, and he basically was able to sort of take the kind of entrepreneurial risks and understand those risks that maybe a pure financial person can't do.
A different lens.
Exactly, and that's also when you look at something like America, why did the tech sort of VC world not grow out of New York? I mean, think about it. The center of finance is Wall Street, right? All the bankers are in New York. So why wouldn't the VC world start in New York? It had nothing to do with the money. It had everything to do with where were the builders, and the builders were in Silicon Valley. Now, with Web3 though, what's interesting is that because people are making money in Web3, I see it more as a global opportunity. So I don't see it as specific to Hong Kong or Dubai. Because notice how when someone makes money in Web3, they actually reinvest it back into Web3.
Yeah.
They buy tokens, they do farming, they do whatever, but they essentially, they might buy an NFT, but actually they reinvest it back into the market, which is why, broadly speaking, crypto, outside of ETFs, has been such a locked market. And I think this is actually why Web3 is kind of like a giant Silicon Valley from my perspective. And actually I think, how do you create this leadership mindset is basically, it will take time as long as you essentially make it easy for people to continue to invest in the space. But it comes down to having more entrepreneurs and more builders essentially finding success so they can then take their know-how and start investing in their own way.
Thank you. Great. Thank you for your time, Yat.
Of course, my pleasure.
Very insightful session. Thank you.
Thank you so much.